Picture yourself standing in the Forum Romanum on a sweltering summer day in 73 BCE. The marble gleams white-hot under the Mediterranean sun, and the air shimmers with heat and the smell of olive oil, roasted meat, and, well, let's just say ancient Rome wasn't particularly known for its sewage system. Around you, the greatest empire the world has ever known pulses with life and power. Senators in pristine togas debate the fate of nations while trying not to trip over the draped fabric, a skill that apparently took years to master. You'd think after centuries they'd have invented a better outfit for running an empire, but Romans were nothing if not traditional. If it worked for our ancestors, it's good enough for us. Never mind that their ancestors mostly wore animal skins and lived in mud huts. But beneath this marble magnificence lies a darker foundation, one built quite literally on the backs of human beings. Imagine the sounds, the chink of chains, the shuffle of sandaled feet, the quiet conversations in dozens of languages from across the known world. These are the slaves of Rome, perhaps 3 million souls in an empire of 12 million. They are the invisible hands that make everything possible. The cooks, cleaners, teachers, doctors, entertainers, and warriors who keep the Roman machine running smoothly. Take a moment to absorb this contradiction. Rome calls itself the beacon of civilization, yet 1 in 4 people you see has no legal right to exist as anything more than property. It's rather like hosting a dinner party about human dignity while your servants are chained in the kitchen. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, but somehow it works, at least for those at the top. Among these countless anonymous faces moves a man whose name will echo through history long after the marble statues of emperors have crumbled to dust. He doesn't know it yet. Right now, he's just another piece of human merchandise in the gladiatorial schools of Capua. But within months, he'll lead the greatest slave rebellion in history and shake the Roman Empire to its very foundations. His name is Spartacus, and this is his remarkable story. Let yourself drift back even further to the wild mountains of Thrace in what we now call Bulgaria. Picture a land of snow-capped peaks and dense forests where wolves still roam and the Roman eagles have barely begun to cast their shadows. This is a place where warriors are born, not made, and where freedom isn't a philosophical concept, it's as essential as breathing. Here, sometime around 110 BCE, a boy is born who will grow up to be Spartacus. Imagine him as a child, running barefoot through mountain villages, learning to hunt with his father, listening to stories of ancient heroes around flickering fires. The Thracians are a proud people, cousins to the Greeks, but fiercer, wilder, less concerned with philosophy, and more focused on the practical matter of staying alive in a harsh landscape. Now, our sources about Spartacus's early life are frustratingly vague. Ancient historians were much better at recording the dining habits of emperors than the childhood adventures of slaves. It's rather like trying to piece together someone's biography from their grocery receipts. You get the basic facts, but miss all the interesting details. What we do know is that Spartacus likely served as a soldier, possibly even fighting alongside the Romans before eventually fighting against them. Picture a young Thracian warrior, perhaps 20 years old, standing 6 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5. His arms are thick from wielding sword and spear, his hands calloused from years of manual labor, his eyes sharp from scanning mountainous horizons for enemies. The transition from free warrior to Roman slave probably happened gradually, as it did for thousands of others. Maybe his tribe was defeated in one of Rome's endless frontier wars. Maybe he was captured during a raid gone wrong. Or perhaps, and this is where it gets interesting, he actually served in the Roman auxiliary forces before deserting and becoming what the Romans politely called a bandit and what we might call a freedom fighter. You see, the Romans had a wonderful talent for creating their own enemies. They'd recruit foreign warriors to fight their battles, then treat them as expendable assets rather than valued allies. When these warriors inevitably got fed up with Roman arrogance and decided to go home, the Romans would hunt them down as deserters. It's rather like hiring someone to paint your house than being shocked when they want to be paid. The capture itself probably wasn't dramatic. No epic battle, no heroic last stand. More likely, Spartacus was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when a Roman slave-hunting expedition swept through his area. One moment he's a free man. The next, he's wearing chains and trudging toward Italy in a coffle of prisoners. Picture that journey. Weeks of walking in leg irons, sleeping on hard ground, eating whatever scraps the guards threw at the prisoners. For a man who'd spent his life roaming freely through mountain forests, this must have been psychological torture as much as physical hardship. But here's the thing about Spartacus. Adversity didn't break him, it forged him into something harder and more dangerous. Now let yourself imagine arriving at the gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, about 150 miles south of Rome. If you're picturing something from a Hollywood movie, all marble columns and dramatic architecture, adjust your expectations downward, way downward. Think more military prison with entertainment value. The ludus, as it was called, was essentially a barracks surrounded by high walls and armed guards. Picture a rectangular compound with small, cramped cells lining the walls, a central courtyard for training, and an atmosphere that can best be described as controlled desperation with a side of mortality. Lentulus Batiatus, the school's owner, was what we might charitably call an entrepreneur. Less charitably, he was a human trafficker who happened to own a business license. He purchased slaves with fighting potential, trained them to kill entertainingly, and rented them out to amphitheaters across Italy. It was, by any measure, a deeply unpleasant way to make a living, but apparently quite profitable. Romans did love their blood sports. It was like reality TV, but with actual reality and more screaming. Picture Spartacus on his first day, being processed like livestock. A Roman doctor examines his teeth, checks his muscle tone, tests his reflexes. Thracian, the man notes approvingly. Good stock, they breed 'em tough up there. It's the kind of clinical assessment you'd give to a horse, which tells you everything you need to know about Roman attitudes toward human dignity. The training regime was designed to keep gladiators in peak physical condition while crushing their spirits completely. Up before dawn for exercises that would make a modern Navy SEAL weep. Hours of weapons practice under the scorching Italian sun. Meals calculated to provide just enough nutrition to maintain muscle mass without promoting rebellion. Though frankly, if you've ever tried to lead a revolution on an empty stomach, you know it's harder than it sounds. The weapons training was where Spartacus truly excelled. Picture him learning the curved Sika sword that would become his signature weapon, a nasty piece of steel designed for close-quarters combat. The Sika was particularly favored by Thracian gladiators, partly for cultural reasons and partly because it was excellent for getting around shields and armor. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a tactical knife, if tactical knives were 2 feet long and designed by people who really didn't like their enemies. But here's where the Romans made their first crucial mistake with Spartacus. They assumed that physical dominance would lead to mental submission. This might work with some people, but Thracians were notorious for their stubborn streak. Tell a Thracian he can't do something, and he'll immediately start planning ways to do it just to spite you. It's a cultural characteristic that the Romans apparently never fully understood. The gladiator barracks were a melting pot of the ancient world's most dangerous men. Picture Spartacus meeting his future co-conspirators. Crixus, a massive Gaul with arms like tree trunks and a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush. Enemaus, a German warrior whose idea of subtle diplomacy involved hitting things with hammers. And dozens of others from across the empire, Syrians, Celts, Africans, Greeks, all united by their shared hatred of their situation. These men had been soldiers, hunters, warriors in their former lives. Now they were expected to fight for the entertainment of the very people who had enslaved them. It's rather like asking a professional chef to cook for people who've just burned down their restaurant. Technically possible, but you probably shouldn't expect him to be happy about it. The psychological pressure was immense. Gladiators knew that every training session might be their last, every meal might be their final one. Some broke under the strain, becoming docile and accepting their fate. Others, like Spartacus, began to plot. Picture a warm spring evening in 73 BCE. The guards at the gladiator school are relaxed, perhaps sharing a cup of wine and complaining about the heat. After all, what could possibly go wrong? The gladiators are locked up tight, the walls are high, and everyone knows that slave rebellions never amount to anything serious. It's like leaving your car unlocked in a nice neighborhood. What are the odds? Well, as it turns out, considerably higher than the Romans calculated. Spartacus had been planning this escape for months, carefully selecting his co-conspirators and waiting for the perfect moment. The plan was audaciously simple, which is often the best kind. During the evening meal, when the guards were at their most relaxed, the conspirators would overpower them, break into the kitchen, and arm themselves with whatever they could find. Now, arming themselves in the kitchen might not sound particularly threatening, but you've never seen what a determined gladiator can do with a meat cleaver. These men had spent years learning to turn anything into a weapon, a skill that proves remarkably useful when staging impromptu rebellions. Picture the moment it began. Spartacus gives the signal, probably just a nod, nothing dramatic, and suddenly the mess hall erupts into chaos. Guards who moments before were worried about whether their dinner was getting cold are now desperately wondering if they'll live to see dessert. The gladiators moved with the coordinated precision of men who've trained together for years, because that's exactly what they are. Within minutes, they've secured the armory and the exits. Picture Crixus wielding a kitchen knife the size of a small sword, grinning like a man who's just discovered that Christmas comes early when you make your own rules. Onemus has somehow acquired what appears to be an entire leg of lamb, though whether for eating or fighting is unclear. With Germans, it could go either way. But here's where Spartacus showed his first flash of strategic genius. Instead of immediately fleeing into the countryside, he ordered his men to set fire to the gladiator school. This wasn't just revenge, though I'm sure that was satisfying. It was a practical decision. The fire would create chaos, draw attention, and prevent quick pursuit. Plus, it sent a message that would echo across Italy. The gladiators weren't just escaping, they were declaring war. As the flames rose into the night sky, our rebels grabbed whatever supplies they could carry and melted into the darkness. Behind them, Capua was in uproar. Messengers were already riding hard toward Rome, carrying news that would give senators indigestion for weeks to come. The gladiators had escaped, and they were armed with kitchen utensils and righteous fury. The initial group was small, perhaps 70 men at most. In an empire of 12 million, they should have been nothing more than a minor irritation like a mosquito at a banquet. But sometimes history has a sense of humor, and that tiny mosquito is carrying something that will bring down the entire feast. Picture Mount Vesuvius in 73 BCE. decades before it would famously bury Pompeii and make volcanology a respectable career choice. The mountain looms over the Bay of Naples, its slopes covered in vineyards and olive groves, its crater dormant and seemingly harmless. To the Romans, it's just another scenic backdrop. To Spartacus, it's about to become the headquarters of the largest slave rebellion in history. The fugitive gladiators make camp in the crater itself, a decision that shows either brilliant strategic thinking or a complete lack of understanding about volcanic geology. Fortunately for them, Vesuvius is in one of its quiet periods, so their biggest worry is Roman legions rather than lava flows. Still, you have to admire the symbolism, rebels literally camping inside a sleeping giant. Now here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. Word of the escape spreads through the slave communities of southern Italy like wildfire, if wildfire could carry messages and inspire hope in the hearts of the oppressed. Picture the conversations in slave quarters across Campania. Did you hear? The gladiators broke out. They're free. They're fighting back. The initial Roman response was exactly what you'd expect from a people who'd never faced a serious slave rebellion: confident, dismissive, and completely inadequate. The local praetor, essentially a regional governor, sent a small force to deal with what he assumed was a minor disturbance. After all, how dangerous could a handful of escaped slaves be? This attitude would prove to be roughly as wise as poking a sleeping bear because you assume it's just a large furry rock. Spartacus, however, understood something the Romans didn't. Revolution is contagious. Every success draws more followers, and every follower makes the next success more likely. It's like a pyramid scheme, but instead of selling dubious health supplements, you're selling freedom and revenge. Picture the scene as the first Roman force arrives at Vesuvius. The commander probably expects to find a disorganized rabble hiding in caves. Instead, he discovers a disciplined force occupying the high ground, led by men who've spent years studying Roman military tactics from the receiving end. It's rather like a chess master discovering his opponent has been watching his games and taking notes. The battle itself was swift and decisive. Spartacus demonstrated tactical brilliance that caught the Romans completely off guard. Using ropes made from vines, his men descended the steepest face of the crater, the one the Romans weren't watching because they assumed it was unscalable, and attacked from behind. It's the ancient equivalent of breaking into a house through the chimney because nobody bothers to lock the roof. The Roman force was routed, their weapons captured, their commander probably writing very awkward reports to his superiors, explaining how a handful of kitchen knife-wielding slaves had just humiliated a Roman military unit. Well, you see, sir, they came down the mountain like Spider-Man, and frankly, we hadn't prepared for that particular scenario in our tactical manuals. But more importantly, word of this victory spread even faster than news of the original escape. Suddenly, slaves across southern Italy began to believe something that had seemed impossible: the Romans could be beaten. Picture the transformation of Spartacus's force. What began as 70 desperate gladiators was becoming something far more dangerous: an army. Runaway slaves began arriving daily, sometimes in ones and twos, sometimes in entire groups. Many brought valuable skills. Former soldiers contributed military expertise. Craftsmen provided technical knowledge. Farmers knew the local terrain. Within weeks, Spartacus commanded not hundreds, but thousands. These weren't just household slaves seeking better treatment. Many were agricultural workers who'd been brutalized for years, prisoners of war who remembered their homelands, skilled artisans reduced to property. Each had their own grievances against Rome, their own reasons for risking everything on this impossible gamble. The logistics alone should have been overwhelming. How do you feed, organize, and command an army that grows larger every day? How do you maintain discipline among men who've spent years being told they're less than human? How do you forge a unified force from dozens of different cultures, languages, and fighting traditions? Spartacus managed it through a combination of natural charisma, tactical brilliance, and what we might call democratic leadership, unusual in the ancient world, where most armies functioned on strict hierarchy and absolute obedience. He listened to his subordinates, incorporated their expertise, and somehow convinced thousands of desperate people that they could achieve the impossible. By the end of 73 BCE, the minor slave disturbance had become a full-scale rebellion threatening the economic foundation of southern Italy. Roman slave owners were fleeing north, taking their portable wealth with them. Trade routes were disrupted. Agricultural production, the basis of Italian prosperity, ground to a halt in affected regions. And this was just the beginning. Picture the Roman Senate in early 72 BCE trying to process reports that must have seemed like dispatches from an alternate universe. A slave army, had not only defeated one Roman force, but several. They had captured entire towns, freed thousands more slaves, and were now moving through southern Italy like a force of nature with tactical training. The senator's first instinct was probably to check if someone had been slipping hallucinogenic herbs into the wine supply. Slaves simply didn't do this sort of thing. They grumbled, they occasionally stole small items, they sometimes ran away individually, but they didn't form armies and start conquering territory. It violated the natural order of things, like dogs deciding to become tax collectors, or fish taking up mountain climbing. But the reports kept coming, and they were getting worse. Spartacus had divided his growing army into multiple columns, each led by experienced commanders. Crixus took the Gauls and Germans, men who fought like berserkers and celebrated victory by drinking wine from the skulls of their enemies, though, to be fair, this was probably just good recycling in an age before proper glassware. Oneamus led another group, while Spartacus himself commanded the largest force, which had grown to include not just escaped slaves, but also poor free Romans, who saw joining the rebellion as better than starving quietly. Their strategy was elegantly simple: strike fast, win decisively, free every slave they encountered, and use their growing numbers to strike again. It's like playing Risk with the advantage that every territory you conquer gives you more armies, while your opponent's forces remain static and confused. The Romans, meanwhile, were discovering that conventional tactics didn't work particularly well against an enemy that had no fixed positions to defend and no supply lines to cut. Try to pin down Spartacus's army, and it would split apart and regroup elsewhere. Attack one column, and the others would strike your flanks. It was like trying to fight smoke, frustrating, exhausting, and ultimately futile. Picture the Battle of Mount Garganus, where Spartacus faced a much larger Roman force under the command of Praetor Varinius. The Romans had learned from their earlier defeats and brought serious military power to bear. Multiple legions, experienced officers, proper siege equipment. They should have crushed the slave army like ants under a boot. Instead, Spartacus pulled off one of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history. He feigned retreat, drawing the Romans into rough terrain where their numerical superiority meant nothing. Then he turned and attacked with such ferocity that the legions broke and ran. Varinius himself barely escaped, abandoning his personal effects in his haste to avoid becoming a footnote in somebody else's victory speech. But here's the detail that must have given Roman commanders nightmares. Spartacus captured Varinius's own horse and equipment. Picture the symbolism of a former slave riding the war horse of a Roman praetor, wearing armor that cost more than most people saw in a lifetime. It was like a cosmic joke at Rome's expense, and everyone was laughing except the Romans. The psychological impact was enormous. Word spread throughout Italy that the slaves weren't just winning, they were making the Romans look foolish in the process. More recruits flocked to Spartacus's banner, bringing not just numbers, but increasing legitimacy. This wasn't looking like a desperate last stand anymore. It was starting to resemble an actual military campaign with achievable objectives. At this point, Spartacus commanded an estimated 40,000 followers. To put that in perspective, that's larger than many Roman legions, and far larger than most armies of the ancient world. These weren't just angry slaves with improvised weapons anymore, they were a genuine military force, disciplined, experienced, and increasingly well-equipped with captured Roman gear. The rebellion was also becoming economically devastating. Southern Italy's agricultural system, entirely dependent on slave labor, was collapsing. Wealthy Romans were fleeing north with whatever portable wealth they could carry. Trade routes were disrupted. The Italian economy, which depended on the predictable exploitation of human labor, was discovering what happened when that labor decided to renegotiate the terms of employment at spear point. Perhaps most terrifying for the Roman elite, the rebellion was inspiring similar uprisings elsewhere. Reports came in of slave revolts in Sicily, Gaul, even near Rome itself. It was like a virus spreading through the empire's foundation, threatening to bring down the entire structure. And through it all, Spartacus demonstrated not just military brilliance, but remarkable political wisdom. He maintained discipline among his diverse army, distributed captured wealth fairly, and, crucially, avoided the kind of random violence that would have turned public opinion against him. This wasn't a rampage, it was a revolution with clear objectives and moral authority, which made it infinitely more dangerous than anything Rome had faced before. Picture the Roman Senate in late 72 BCE and imagine the collective sound of very expensive togas being twisted into knots. The Spartacus situation had officially graduated from minor provincial disturbance to existential threat to Roman civilization. And the usual solutions weren't working. Sending random praetors with small armies was like trying to stop a forest fire with a water balloon, theoretically based on sound principles, but woefully inadequate in practice. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man so wealthy he made other rich people feel like they were applying for government assistance. Crassus had built his fortune through a combination of smart investments, political connections, and what we might politely call aggressive real estate acquisition during civil disturbances. He owned silver mines, vast estates, hundreds of slaves, and apparently had enough spare cash to personally fund military campaigns, which in ancient Rome was the equivalent of owning your own space program. But Crassus wasn't just rich, he was also ambitious in that particularly Roman way that combined genuine patriotism with burning personal ambition. He looked at the Spartacus crisis and saw opportunity. Defeat this slave rebellion, and he'd be the man who saved the Republic. The Senate would owe him favors, the people would worship him, and his political rivals would have to find new ways to diminish his achievements. It was like winning the lottery while simultaneously solving world hunger. Good for everyone, but especially good for you. Picture Crassus in his villa, studying maps and reports while surrounded by the kind of luxury that would make modern billionaires weep with envy. Golden statues, silk tapestries, marble floors so polished you could use them as mirrors, and probably staff whose job it was to ensure his wine was always at the perfect temperature. This was a man who could afford to buy solutions to his problems, and he was about to discover that some problems cost more than others. The Senate granted Crassus extraordinary command authority and permission to raise 8 legions, roughly 50,000 professional soldiers, the largest Roman army assembled in decades. This wasn't a police action anymore. This was total war. Crassus spared no expense, recruiting the best officers, securing the finest equipment, and establishing supply lines that could maintain a massive army in the field indefinitely. But here's what made Crassus truly dangerous. He understood that this wasn't just a military problem. Spartacus had succeeded because he'd combined tactical brilliance with political intelligence, appealing not just to slaves but to all of Rome's dispossessed. Crassus realized he needed to match that political dimension while bringing overwhelming military force to bear. His first decision was to establish a defensive line across southern Italy, essentially building a wall to contain the rebellion. Picture Roman engineers working around the clock, constructing fortifications, digging trenches, creating a barrier 40 miles long from coast to coast. It was like building a fence around a wildfire, ambitious, expensive, and requiring perfect execution to work at all. The wall itself was a marvel of Roman engineering efficiency, 15 feet high, backed by a ditch of equal depth, defended by watchtowers and constant patrols. Crassus was essentially treating Spartacus like a military equal, acknowledging that containing him required the same kind of massive infrastructure project the Romans would use against foreign armies. But Crassus also understood psychological warfare. He reinstated the ancient punishment of decimation for units that showed cowardice, literally executing 1 in 10 soldiers chosen by lot to encourage the other 9 to fight harder. It's the kind of motivational technique that would never pass modern HR review, but it certainly got everyone's attention. Meanwhile, Spartacus was facing his own strategic challenges. His army had grown to perhaps 60,000 followers, but size brought complications. Feeding that many people required constant movement and foraging. Maintaining discipline among such diverse groups, escaped slaves, free Romans, foreign prisoners of war, was like herding cats, if cats carried swords and had strong opinions about military strategy. More crucially, Spartacus had to decide what his ultimate objective actually was. Did he want to escape Italy entirely, perhaps returning to Thrace with his followers? Did he aim to establish a permanent free territory within Roman borders, or was he actually trying to overthrow the Roman system entirely? These weren't just academic questions, they would determine everything about his military and political strategy going forward. Picture the war council where these decisions were debated. Crixus arguing for immediate attack on Rome itself. Let's finish this while we have momentum. Onymos advocating for defensive positions in southern Italy. We hold what we've taken and make them come to us. Other commanders proposing various alternatives, each based on their own cultural background and personal experiences. And Crassus, listening to all of them while knowing that whatever he decided would affect the lives of everyone who'd trusted him with their freedom. No pressure at all. The stage was set for the final act of this remarkable drama. On one side, the richest man in Rome commanding the largest army the Republic could muster, backed by the full resources of an empire. On the other, a former slave leading a revolutionary force that had already achieved the impossible multiple times. Something had to give, and when it did, the consequences would echo through history. Picture southern Italy in the winter of 72-71 BCE, a landscape transformed by war into something resembling a giant chessboard where the pieces are armed and very, very motivated. Crassus's wall stretches across the peninsula like a concrete reminder that even in the ancient world, Romans believed that enough engineering could solve any problem. Behind it, Spartacus's army camps in the mountains, 60,000 souls who've gambled everything on the impossible dream of freedom. The irony is delicious. The wealthiest man in Rome has built a wall to keep out people who officially own nothing. It's like using a solid gold cage to trap shadows. Technically impressive, but missing some fundamental point about the nature of what you're trying to contain. Winter campaigns were unusual in the ancient world, mostly because armies preferred not to freeze to death while trying to kill each other. But desperation makes people creative, and both sides were getting desperate. Crassus needed to end this rebellion before it inspired similar uprisings across the empire. Spartacus needed to break out before his army consumed itself through inactivity and internal tensions. The first major clash came when Spartacus attempted to break through Crassus's wall. Picture the scene: a winter night, snow beginning to fall, and suddenly the Roman sentries see torches moving in the darkness. Not just a few torches, thousands of them, like fallen stars advancing across the landscape. Spartacus had decided to fill in a section of Crassus's ditch with fascines, bundles of wood and brush, then storm the wall with his entire army. It was audaciously direct, the kind of plan that either works spectacularly or fails catastrophically, with very little middle ground. Rather like proposing marriage on the first date: bold, dramatic, and likely to produce a definitive result one way or another. The battle raged through the night. Picture Roman legionaries, supposedly the finest soldiers in the world, fighting desperately to hold their positions against an enemy that attacked with the fury of people who knew they were fighting for their lives. Spartacus's followers weren't just trying to win a battle, they were trying to break through to freedom itself. And remarkably, they succeeded. By dawn, a significant portion of Spartacus's army had broken through the wall and was moving north toward the Alps. Crassus's great engineering project, which had cost enormous amounts of time and money, had been breached in a single night by people using sticks and sheer determination. But this is where the story takes a tragic turn that still gives historians headaches. Instead of continuing north toward the Alps and potential escape, Spartacus turned his army around and marched back toward southern Italy. Why would he abandon success and retreat into the trap he'd just escaped? The ancient sources offer various explanations, none entirely satisfactory. Some say his army was divided about objectives. Crixus wanted to continue fighting Romans rather than fleeing Italy. Others suggest Spartacus believed he could defeat Crassus decisively and establish a permanent free territory. Still others think he was trying to evacuate his followers by ship from southern ports. What we know for certain is that this decision doomed the rebellion. Picture Crassus receiving reports of the breakthrough, probably feeling like a man who just watched his expensive new security system get defeated by a coat hanger. But then came the incredible news: the slaves were coming back. It was like watching someone break out of prison, then voluntarily return to their cell because they'd forgotten their toothbrush. Crassus immediately recognized the opportunity. Instead of chasing Spartacus north into difficult terrain, he could now fight on ground of his choosing with his full army concentrated. He also sent urgent messages to Rome requesting additional support. Specifically, he wanted Pompey's legions recalled from Spain to block any northern escape route. This created a terrible strategic situation for Spartacus. He was now facing not just Crassus's 8 legions from the south, but Pompey's additional forces approaching from the north. It was like being caught between a hammer and an anvil, if the hammer and anvil were both made of sharp Roman steel and operated by people with strong opinions about property rights. The final battles were a series of running engagements, as Spartacus tried desperately to avoid being trapped between the two Roman armies. Picture his forces fragmenting under the pressure. Some groups breaking off to try independent escape attempts, others clustering around their original ethnic communities, the whole revolutionary army slowly coming apart under the stress of imminent defeat. Crixus fell in one of these battles along with thousands of his Gallic and German followers. Oenomus had died earlier in the campaign. One by one, Spartacus was losing not just soldiers, but the experienced commanders who'd made his early victories possible. It was like watching a brilliant symphony orchestra slowly lose musicians until a few instruments remained, trying to play music written for a full ensemble. And through it all, Spartacus continued to demonstrate the tactical brilliance that had brought him this far. Even in retreat, even facing overwhelming odds, he managed to inflict serious casualties on his pursuers and keep the remnants of his army together. Roman casualties were heavy enough that Crassus must have wondered whether victory was worth the cost, though, given his wealth, he could probably afford to wonder about such things more easily than most. But mathematics is inexorable, and the mathematics of this situation were brutally simple. Every engagement cost Spartacus irreplaceable soldiers and commanders. Every day that passed brought Pompey's legions closer. Every mile they retreated narrowed their options further. The end, when it came, was as dramatic as everything else about this remarkable story. Picture the battlefield in Lucania, southern Italy, in the spring of 71 BCE. The morning mist rises from ground soaked with blood, and silence settles over a scene that will haunt Roman nightmares for generations. Spartacus lies dead among his followers, still clutching the curved sica that had become the symbol of slave rebellion. Around him, the remnants of an army that once numbered 60,000 souls are scattered like leaves after a storm. But here's the remarkable thing about defeat. Sometimes it echoes louder through history than victory. Spartacus had failed to overthrow the Roman system or establish lasting freedom for his followers, but he'd done something arguably more important. He'd proven it was possible to fight back and win, at least for a while. Crassus, surveying his expensive victory, probably felt like a man who just spent a fortune to kill a wasp. Technically successful, but somehow unsatisfying given the cost. His legions had suffered heavy casualties, his reputation was tarnished by how long the campaign had taken, and worst of all, Pompey had arrived just in time to claim credit for the final victory. It's like organizing a dinner party where all the work falls to you, but your neighbor gets thanked for bringing in the wine. The immediate aftermath was typically Roman in its brutal efficiency. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Rome to southern Italy. Picture that grisly monument, crosses stretching for 130 miles, a forest of human suffering designed to send a message that would be visible from space if satellites had existed in 71 BCE. The message was simple. This is what happens to property that forgets its place. But messages, like boomerangs, sometimes come back to hit the sender in unexpected ways. Those crucifixes became inadvertent monuments to Spartacus's courage, reminders that 6,000 people had chosen death over slavery. Every Roman who traveled that road had to confront the uncomfortable reality that their comfortable lifestyle depended on the systematic brutalization of human beings who, given the chance, fought like heroes for their freedom. The Roman elite tried to minimize Spartacus's achievement, portraying the rebellion as a minor disturbance led by a deluded slave who got lucky a few times. Ancient historians, writing for Roman audiences, downplayed his tactical brilliance and political wisdom. It's rather like describing the American Revolution as a small tax dispute that got out of hand. Technically accurate in the narrowest sense, but missing the larger point entirely. Yet even Roman attempts at damage control revealed the rebellion's true impact. New laws were passed restricting gladiator schools and limiting the concentration of armed slaves. Military tactics were revised based on lessons learned fighting Spartacus's unconventional army. The Roman legal system was modified to prevent future mass escapes. When an empire changes its fundamental institutions in response to a minor disturbance, you know the disturbance wasn't as minor as they're pretending. Now, let yourself imagine the conversations taking place in slave quarters across the empire in the months and years following Spartacus's defeat. Picture whispered discussions by lamplight, stories passed from mouth to mouth, legends growing with each telling. The basic facts might get embellished. Spartacus becomes taller, stronger, more heroic with each retelling, but the essential truth remains. A slave had led an army that made Rome tremble. These stories were dangerous precisely because they were true. Every slave who heard them learned that rebellion was possible, that Romans could be beaten, that freedom was something you could fight for rather than simply hope for. It's like learning that the monster under your bed is actually afraid of flashlights. Suddenly the whole dynamic changes. The political consequences rippled through Roman society in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent for generations. The rebellion had demonstrated that Rome's economic foundation, slave labor, was inherently unstable. You can only push people so far before they push back, and when they do, the results can be catastrophic. More immediately, the Spartacus campaign had given both Crassus and Pompey the military credentials they needed for their ongoing political rivalry. Picture the Roman Senate trying to manage two extremely ambitious, extremely wealthy men who now commanded the loyalty of battle-hardened legions. It's like having two rival CEOs, each backed by their own private armies, trying to run the same company. The potential for conflict is obvious, and conflict is exactly what they got. This rivalry would eventually lead to the first triumvirate, the informal alliance between Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar that effectively ended the Roman Republic. In a very real sense, Spartacus's rebellion set in motion the chain of events that would transform Rome from a republic into an empire. One escaped gladiator's fight for freedom had accidentally created the conditions for imperial autocracy. History has a sense of irony that would be amusing if the consequences weren't so profound. But the rebellion's influence extended far beyond Roman politics. Picture the impact on slave communities throughout the ancient world. From Egypt to Britain, from Spain to Syria, the story of Spartacus spread like wildfire. Other slave revolts followed, each inspired by his example, even if none achieved his level of success. More subtly, the rebellion changed how people thought about slavery itself. Before Spartacus, slavery was largely accepted as a natural institution, an unfortunate but inevitable part of human society. Afterward, it became harder to ignore the moral contradictions involved. If slaves could organize, fight, and lead with such effectiveness, how could anyone claim they were naturally inferior to their masters? This philosophical shift took centuries to fully develop, but Spartacus had planted seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into more systematic criticism of human bondage. Early Christians, many of whom were slaves or former slaves themselves, found inspiration in stories of resistance to unjust authority. Philosophers began questioning whether slavery was truly compatible with justice and human dignity. The military innovations developed during the rebellion also had lasting impact. Spartacus had demonstrated the effectiveness of guerrilla tactics against conventional armies, showed how diverse ethnic groups could be welded into effective military units, and proved that motivated irregular forces could defeat professional soldiers under the right circumstances. These lessons would be studied and applied by military commanders for centuries. Picture a medieval monastery, perhaps in Ireland or northern England, where monks are copying ancient texts by candlelight. One of them is transcribing Plutarch's account of Spartacus's rebellion, and he pauses occasionally to cross himself when he reads about the gladiators' victories over Roman legions. To these Christian scribes, Spartacus wasn't just a historical figure, he was a symbol of resistance to oppression, a reminder that God sometimes works through the most unlikely instruments. The transformation of Spartacus from historical person to legendary symbol is one of the most fascinating aspects of his story. Each age has reinvented him to fit its own needs and values, like a historical mirror that reflects the concerns of whoever looks into it. Medieval chroniclers saw him as a champion of the oppressed against tyrannical authority, a theme that resonated strongly in societies where feudal lords held life-and-death power over their subjects. Renaissance writers, rediscovering classical texts, were inspired by his tactical brilliance and personal charisma. Enlightenment philosophers used his story to critique the institution of slavery and argue for natural human equality. But it was the modern era that truly embraced Spartacus as a revolutionary icon. Picture the impact of his story on people fighting their own battles against oppression. American slaves hearing whispered accounts of the gladiator who fought Rome itself. French revolutionaries invoking his name as they stormed the Bastille. Russian serfs dreaming of their own uprising against the czars. The 19th and 20th centuries saw Spartacus become a symbol for virtually every liberation movement imaginable. Socialists claimed him as the first communist revolutionary, nationalists saw him as a freedom fighter against imperial oppression, civil rights activists found inspiration in his multi-ethnic army that united people across racial and cultural lines. Even modern military strategists studied his campaigns for lessons about irregular warfare and coalition building. Perhaps most remarkably, Spartacus became a symbol that transcended political boundaries. Both sides in the Cold War claimed him, Americans as a freedom fighter against tyrannical government, Soviets as a revolutionary leader of the oppressed masses. It's rather like having a historical figure so compelling that everyone wants to recruit him for their cause, regardless of what he actually believed or intended. Hollywood, naturally, couldn't resist such rich material. The 1960 film Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas and directed by Stanley Kubrick, introduced the gladiator to global audiences and cemented his status as a pop culture icon. The famous "I am Spartacus" scene, where slaves protect their leader by each claiming his identity, has become shorthand for solidarity and collective resistance to authority. But here's what's fascinating about the Hollywood version. It's both historically inaccurate and emotionally true. The real Spartacus probably never gave speeches about freedom and dignity. We have no record of his words or philosophical beliefs, yet the film captures something authentic about his story. The idea that ordinary people, when pushed too far, can achieve extraordinary things. Modern historians continue to debate Spartacus's motivations and objectives. Was he primarily seeking personal freedom, or did he have a broader vision of social transformation? Did he intend to overthrow the Roman system or just escape from it? Was he driven by political ideology, personal revenge, or simple survival instinct? The honest answer is that we don't know, and we probably never will. The ancient sources are limited and biased, written by Romans who had little interest in understanding a slave's perspective. Spartacus himself left no writings, no speeches, no clear statement of his beliefs or goals. In some ways, he remains as mysterious today as he was to his Roman contemporaries. As you settle into the comfort of your bed tonight, far from the dust and blood of ancient battlefields, consider what lessons this extraordinary story holds for our modern world. Spartacus lived over 2,000 years ago in a society so different from ours that we can barely imagine its daily realities, yet his story continues to resonate because it touches on truths that transcend time and culture. First, it reminds us that systems of oppression, no matter how powerful they appear, contain the seeds of their own destruction. Rome seemed invincible in 73 BCE, a superpower controlling most of the known world, backed by seemingly unlimited resources and military might. Yet a small group of escaped slaves brought this colossus to its knees, at least temporarily. No system is so strong that it cannot be challenged. No authority so absolute that it cannot be questioned. This doesn't mean that all rebellions succeed, or that fighting injustice is easy or safe. Spartacus and most of his followers paid with their lives for their resistance. But their example shows that even failure can be meaningful if it inspires others and plants seeds of future change. Sometimes the most important victories are moral rather than military, won in the realm of human consciousness rather than on physical battlefields. Second, Spartacus's story demonstrates the power of unity across differences. His army included people from dozens of different cultures, speaking different languages, worshiping different gods, following different customs. What united them wasn't shared ethnicity or religion, but shared experience of oppression and shared dreams of freedom. In our own divided world, this remains a powerful reminder that our common humanity transcends the artificial barriers we create to separate ourselves from one another. The rebellion also shows us something important about leadership. Spartacus wasn't born to command, he was a slave, supposedly the lowest form of human life in Roman society. Yet he demonstrated tactical brilliance, political wisdom, and the charisma necessary to hold together a diverse army under impossible conditions. This suggests that leadership potential exists in unexpected places, and that we dismiss it at our own peril when we assume that some people are naturally superior to others. Perhaps most importantly, Spartacus's story reminds us that individual actions can have consequences far beyond what we might imagine. A single moment of decision, choosing to break out of the gladiator school rather than accept his fate, ultimately changed the course of Roman history and echoed through the centuries. We never know which of our own choices might prove similarly significant, which makes it all the more important to choose courage over comfort, justice over convenience, hope over despair. The story also offers insights into the nature of power and resistance. Rome's strength came from its ability to convince subjects that resistance was hopeless, that the system was too powerful to challenge. Spartacus shattered that illusion by demonstrating that power is often more fragile than it appears. Authoritarian systems throughout history have relied on this same psychological strategy, convincing people that opposition is futile. Yet again and again, individuals have proven that this is a lie designed to perpetuate injustice. At the same time, Spartacus's ultimate defeat reminds us that good intentions and moral authority aren't always enough to overcome material disadvantages. His rebellion failed partly because Rome could bring overwhelming resources to bear against him, and partly because maintaining unity among his diverse followers proved impossible under extreme pressure. Modern movements for social change face similar challenges: the need to sustain coalitions across differences, the difficulty of matching well-funded opposition, the temptation to fragment into competing factions. Yet even in defeat, Spartacus achieved something remarkable. He proved that slavery could be resisted, that slaves could fight as effectively as any soldiers, that the Roman military machine was not invincible. These lessons inspired future resistance movements and gradually undermined the ideological foundations of human bondage. Sometimes the most important victories are incomplete, their full significance only becoming apparent generations later. Picture yourself walking through a modern city, any modern city, and look around with fresh eyes. See the homeless individuals that most people hurry past without acknowledging. Notice the service workers who remain invisible despite keeping our society functioning. Observe the quiet desperation of people trapped in jobs that don't pay living wages, or the resignation of those who've given up hope for something better. Now imagine what Spartacus might think of our world. In many ways, we've made tremendous progress since ancient Rome. Legal slavery has been abolished almost everywhere. Democratic ideals have spread across much of the globe. Human rights are recognized, at least in principle, as universal values. Technologies that would seem magical to ancient people have improved life for billions. Yet inequality remains vast and often seems to be growing. Millions of people still live in conditions that would be familiar to Roman slaves, working long hours for subsistence wages, denied meaningful choices about their lives, treated as expendable resources rather than human beings worthy of dignity and respect. The chains may be economic rather than physical, but they constrain human potential just as effectively. This is why Spartacus remains relevant. His story reminds us that accepting injustice as inevitable is a choice, not a necessity. Every generation faces the decision of whether to accommodate themselves to existing wrongs or to risk something in the struggle for something better. Spartacus chose resistance over resignation, action over acceptance, hope over despair, and his choice continues to inspire people facing their own versions of the arena. The gladiator's story also speaks to something deeper about human nature, our capacity for transformation. Spartacus began as property, legally no different from livestock or furniture. Yet he became a military commander, political leader, and historical figure whose name echoes through the millennia. This transformation wasn't just personal, it was categorical, challenging fundamental assumptions about what human beings are capable of when given the chance. In our own time, we often encounter people whose potential seems limited by their circumstances. The child growing up in poverty, the refugee fleeing violence, the worker trapped in exploitative conditions. It's easy to write them off as unfortunate but inevitable casualties of a complex world. Spartacus's story suggests that such resignation is both morally wrong and strategically foolish. We never know which seemingly powerless person might possess the spark of greatness given the right opportunity and support. The rebellion also offers insights into the dynamics of social change. Spartacus didn't succeed by working within the system or appealing to the better nature of slave owners. He succeeded, at least initially, by rejecting the system entirely and creating an alternative based on different principles. Sometimes reform is possible within existing structures, but sometimes those structures are so fundamentally unjust that they must be replaced rather than repaired. This doesn't mean that violence is always necessary or desirable. Spartacus lived in a violent age when peaceful alternatives were largely unavailable. But it does suggest that meaningful change often requires challenging power structures directly rather than hoping they'll reform themselves voluntarily. Those who benefit from injustice rarely give up their advantages without pressure, and pressure requires organization, courage, and strategic thinking. Perhaps most importantly, Spartacus reminds us that the arc of history doesn't automatically bend toward justice. It requires human beings to bend it through conscious effort and sacrifice. Progress isn't inevitable. It's contingent on people choosing to act when action is difficult and dangerous. Every advance in human freedom and dignity has been won by individuals who decided that the status quo wasn't good enough and were willing to risk something to change it. As the candle flames flicker lower in your imagination and you prepare to drift off to sleep, let yourself return one last time to that arena in Capua where our story began. But now, imagine it empty, silent, abandoned. Weeds grow between the stones where crowds once roared for blood. The cells where gladiators waited for their final battles stand open and unused. This isn't just the result of time and neglect. It's the legacy of a man who refused to accept that some human beings exist solely for the entertainment of others. Spartacus didn't abolish gladiatorial games single-handedly, but his rebellion was part of a long process of moral evolution that eventually made such spectacles impossible to justify. Ideas have consequences, and the idea that all people deserve basic dignity, an idea that Spartacus embodied through his actions, has gradually transformed human civilization. The gladiator's final gift to us isn't just inspiration or historical knowledge, it's permission. Permission to believe that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. Permission to think that current injustices aren't permanent features of human society. Permission to hope that our small actions might contribute to changes we can't even imagine. You don't have to lead a rebellion to honor Spartacus's memory. Every time you refuse to ignore injustice, every time you stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves, every time you choose courage over comfort in small daily decisions, you're continuing the fight he began. The arena where you struggle may be a workplace, a classroom, a community meeting, or simply your own conscience, but the principle remains the same. Human dignity is worth defending, and defending it is everyone's responsibility. As you close your eyes tonight, remember that you carry within you the same capacity for moral courage that enabled a Thracian slave to challenge the Roman Empire. The circumstances of your life are different, the challenges you face are different, but the fundamental choice remains the same. Will you accept injustice as inevitable, or will you believe that a better world is possible? Spartacus chose to believe, and that choice echoes still through the centuries, a whisper of hope in the darkness saying that no chain is unbreakable, no oppression eternal, no dream of freedom too bold to attempt. Sleep well knowing that tomorrow offers its own opportunities to choose courage over fear, justice over convenience, hope over despair. The gladiator's fight continues in every person who refuses to give up on the possibility that human beings can be better than they are, that societies can be more just than they are, that the future can be brighter than the past. And in that continuing fight, we are all gladiators in our own way, all struggling for freedom in our own arenas, all carrying the spark of dignity that no empire, however powerful, can ever completely extinguish. The story ends, but the struggle continues. Sleep peacefully, gladiator. Tomorrow, the arena awaits.